All right, I'll tell Sayega. Welcome to our conversation, and thank you, Sarah, Florence, Davidson, for joining me. Today we're talking about what do we mean by story, and maybe we can do like a super quick little introduction of ourselves, just so that people listening in know who we are. So, my name is Nikki Yi, and I'm a colonizer of Chinese and Mennonite ancestry. Yeah, that's the Coles Notes version.
Okay. My name is Sara Florence Davidson. My Haida name is Anjetku Sandlance, which means Killer Whale Woman of the Dawn, and I belong to the Yakut Janas clan from Haida Gwaii. And I am of mixed Haida and settler ancestry. Happy to be here today.
And I am joining from the traditional unceded, ancestral, and contemporary territories of the Coquitlam people. And do you want to
Yeah, and I'm
give a shout
joining
out?
from the unceded territories of the Katzie, the Kwantlen, and the Semyamo peoples.
Awesome. And today, I should say before we start that our purpose in having this conversation and in doing this kind of recording and all of that is so that we can provide some accessible scholarship. So we were watching this Instagram reel by Dr. Raquel Martin, and really kind of inspired us to create these conversations and just to share some of the inspiring things that I learned from Sarah, and hopefully they'll inspire other people too. And we also just want to support learners who are just beginning to engage with story. It's really becoming sort of a popular piece of Indigenous pedagogy that educators are taking up, and we just wanted to support that in some way. So today we're thinking about what do we mean by story? And Sarah, you and I just had this little conversation around sort of the purposes of storytelling. And maybe you just want to
Yeah, yeah,
chat
and
about that.
one of the things that I had mentioned was that I've consistently in doing this work been really inspired by Daniel David Moses, who talks about the purposes being to entertain, to educate, and to heal. And that's really helped me to think more deeply about the stories that I'm learning from and working with. And so when we're thinking about that, we're thinking the language that we've used is mainstream stories, Indigenous stories, and we think about types of Indigenous stories. I'm going to pass to you to talk a little bit about mainstream stories, and then maybe I'll jump in with Indigenous stories.
Yeah, sure. So it's interesting sort of how that framing helps us to think about stories, because there are some stories that are really just for entertainment and maybe very light, sort of surface level kinds of stories. And then there's those stories that are going to do all of three of those things, educate, heal, and entertain, sort of all in one. Not just naming any names, but I'll just hope it's just so we have different kinds of stories, and I think when we understand that sort of framework, then we can be deliberate in terms of what story we're choosing for what purpose. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think with the curriculum shift in BC, especially, we've been thinking more and more about Indigenous stories. And of course, we have these kind of mainstream style stories that are by Indigenous authors and so contemporary Indigenous stories. And I'll just hold up this example of Moon Song, which is stunning by Michaela Goade. And she's done a beautiful, beautiful job of working the story in with her absolutely stunning images. I'm sorry, I have to open the book and just show you. So definitely beautiful, beautiful work coming from her. And I would say that is a more contemporary story that just is really embracing some of the elements of Indigenous storytelling that we're familiar with. And so when we think about when I've learned about Indigenous stories, I haven't done an exhaustive search, but I have noticed that a lot of the nations tend to have these two kinds of stories. There may be more, but they do tend to fall into these categories, sort of the traditional Indigenous stories and what would be considered life experience, so based on people's lived experiences, often told throughout generations. And I use the term in traditional Indigenous stories and not legends or myths, just because of the way that the terms legend and myth tend to be dismissive and not recognize the significance of those stories for nations, for clans, for communities. And if you're interested in learning more about that, I would invite you to look at Dr. Debbie Reese's blog, which you can find in the description for this video. She does an incredible job of just providing some of that information, also doing great critique of Indigenous representation, specifically in predominantly children's literature, some YA, and Gregory Younging's Elements of Indigenous. Oh, look at us. I understand there's a second edition as well, but those are great sources. And what I've appreciated about Gregory Younging, he also speaks to the way that the language that we use, and in this case, helpful to sort of think about the language around legends and myths, and a preference for traditional Indigenous stories, and then life experiences stories, which are actually the Scotta stories that Nikki just held up with Jigging for Halibut with Chinny, are based on those lived experiences that folks have, and those tend to be shared intergenerationally. And when we look at these different kinds of stories, I'll just provide one other distinction. With traditional Indigenous stories, we tend to have a very different kind of story arc. And I'm thinking specifically about a wonderful example, which is Lady Louse by Kwam Kwam Piam, which again, the link for that story is in the little descriptor for the video. But really inviting folks who are listening to the story to be able to make their own meaning, to be able to think about what comes next. Very different. There's not sort of a resolution offered or an interpretation that we would expect to have. And then, we think about a typical story arc where there is this conflict and a resolution at the end. When I'm doing this kind of talk for educators, I tend to talk about the Aesop's fable, where we've got a story that has been designed to offer a particular interpretation, a particular understanding or message or teaching. And then we have these other stories that really invite a listener to make meaning-based, which is a little snapshot into what we're talking about next time, but invites listeners to really think about and maybe go in lots of different directions. Yeah.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And just thinking about, when you're talking about traditional story, like for me, what's been really striking, and of course, as a non-Indigenous person, I realize I'm only kind of scratching the tip of the iceberg, so I don't have that sort of cultural background. But to think about how a paradigm or worldview is really sort of encapsulated within that story, really makes me feel a sense of like, I don't know, like awe, wonder. Joanne Archibald, Kwam Kwam Shim talks about the idea of reverence in terms of the Indigenous story work principles. And so just feeling that sense of reverence when you come to the story and treating it sort of with that sense of respect, to me is like really important. I kind of see story as having a life of its own, and really doing work in this world that the storyteller and the listener cannot necessarily control, right? It's really kind of has its own sort of autonomous sentience. And so to me, that reverence piece is really important to think about. Story, I hope, a good story to me really, I shouldn't say good because that seems disparaging, right? But some stories that educate, heal, and entertain are really able to open us up so that we can learn from a story in a way that brings us closer to our humanity. And this one of the stories that I thought about was this one. It's not Indigenous, but also to me a really good story. It's called A Song for Paper Children. And similarly, this relates to my own sort of cultural background in terms of the Chinese Canadian experience. And so similarly, having the possibility of being able to entertain, educate, and heal, and really like open me up for a greater exploration of my identity and also like learning experience.
Yeah, and I appreciate you talking a little bit about that because sometimes when we think about those traditional stories, there are, well, I will say there are often protocols associated with those stories. And I've actually suggested to some educators who are sort of nervous about the protocols to actually work with stories like the one you shared. And I haven't read that one, but working with stories that don't have protocols associated, just to practice the protocols. And so when we're thinking about traditional Indigenous stories, we want to think about ownership. Who owns this story in ways that are different from copyright, and so just because something's published doesn't mean that we can bring it into our classroom and share it without any attention to who owns the story. So we think about a community or a clan or a family that potentially owns the story, and what permission do we need to have in order to retell? And so the video that I mentioned, the story of Lady Louse, is one that there has been permission given to tell that story in an educational context. And so working with that recording. Also, just really something that I've been learning more about lately is thinking about my own connections to songs, traditional songs, haida songs, dances, paintings, totem poles, and thinking about how those are different ways to tell stories. And so just sort of expanding that we're not only talking about oral storytelling, that we're also talking about visual storytelling and just different ways that communities share these stories in perhaps non-oral or non-text-based ways. And so when I was watching a video with Kwam Kwam Piam, she kind of mentioned this idea of holistic engagement with stories. And so I've done a lot of workshops with educators on how do we engage holistically with stories. And so coming back to that idea of stories, um, entertaining, educating, and healing. In order for us to get to those more deeper places, we do need to engage with the story more fully. And so there's an activity that I do with students in order to support them to listen to the story mentally, engage in sort of a kind of a drama activity in order to have that physical engagement, thinking about the story that's being told, imagining what they're learning from those characters or how they might interact with those characters. And so in the story, and so this offers this opportunity for holistic engagement. And that's a whole other presentation altogether,
Mhm.
but just really thinking about how can we engage more deeply so that we can learn from and potentially heal from these stories with these stories.
Yeah. And when I was thinking about sort of classroom applications, I like to use story as a way to demonstrate or provide another entry point into the content, right? So I'm very content driven, I guess. But uh, even just thinking about this story, it talks about the Chinese Canadian experience in Canada. And so if that's something that I really want to support, or if, for example, I'm thinking about identity development, so that could be something where I could go to this as an example of how we could, sort of begin to think about our family histories, think about like what it means to have a Chinese identity within Canada and sort of prompt that kind of engagement with the content. So I like to use story as another way of presenting content, which to me is kind of a different way of thinking about story because often story is just seen as adjacent to content or just for entertainment, or it's often like trivialized, I find. And so I want to bring it in as another resource, sort of on par with maybe academic writings or, other sort of nonfiction types of resources. So that's how I like to use story within my courses. Yeah.
And definitely an example of how stories educate.
Yeah. I hope.
Wonderful. And I think the resources we have to share with you today will be in the description of the video below. We've covered just all the ones that we mentioned. And thank you so much for joining us again today.
Thank you.
Bye.